I launched Amplify MedTech in November of 2024. I am Famida Kapadia. I'm the founder of Amplify MedTech. I have a background in medical devices. I've been working with MedTech startups for almost 20 years. And I noticed a gap in the region around support and resources that are very specifically tailored to medtech companies. And that was my purpose for starting Amplify MedTech. So our mission basically is to create a collaborative medtech ecosystem so that we can have more collaboration, sharing of resources, which creates an environment for startups to build and grow and be successful. The easier it is for companies to get access to resources, the faster they are growing. We work with everybody in the ecosystem because we believe that everyone is required. Startups need service providers need startups. Our goal is to create a vibrant, sustainable, and locally engaged ecosystem so that we can stimulate the economic growth of the area as well. So, in the last 9 months, we've been supporting educational events, workshops, and networking. We do in-person events, we do online events that are ongoing on a monthly basis. We also do in-person networking events so that people get a chance to meet and connect with each other in person. As I mentioned, we work with everybody in the ecosystem, just from startups to service providers to entrepreneurial service organizations, economic development agencies, governments, academic institutions, again, because an interplay of all these players is essential for success. Startups need to not only collaborate with investors and service providers, but they also need to be able to collaborate with hospitals and academic institutions in order to move their product development forward. And so keeping that in mind, we collaborate with everyone in the ecosystem. Would love for you to follow us on LinkedIn as well so that you can keep up with everything that's going on with Amplify MedTech, and you can join us as and when it works for you. Our panel today is about navigating the FDA maze. I would like to turn it over to our panelists, Francesca, Martha, and Mo Chaudhry. Francesca, can you kick us off and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm Francesca Joseph. I am a pediatrician. I trained at Children's National and shortly thereafter actually spent several years at the FDA, part in the Center for Devices and also in the Office of Orphan Products Development, where I helped to launch at that time the new FDA-funded Pediatric Device Consortium. And now, in my current role, I'm a recipient of that grant and work with the Alliance for Pediatric Device Innovation as an advisor, and kind of meld my clinical expertise, regulatory, and even more recently, some commercialization and business strategy. Thanks.
Hi, Francesca. Welcome. Martha?
Hi, my name is Martha Wang. I am the Assistant Director at the Fischel Institute for Medical Devices, located at the University of Maryland. I'm an Associate Clinical Professor there, and similar to Francesca, I originally was able to interact with her previous iteration of one of the Pediatric Device Consortiums, where we were able to act as like a coach coordinator for early startup nascent companies, we like to say, looking at pediatric medical devices. But the reason why I'm passionate about this is because I originally came from industry. I'm an unusual academic. I spent time in the trenches trying to figure out how to bring devices to market, trying to understand how to interact with the FDA, and making sure that we pursue developing a regulatory strategy early so that we can have long-term successes and use that FDA relationship as a partnership for success. So I'm excited for this conversation today, Famida. I think that it's going to be great. So thanks for including me.
Thank you, Martha. And last but not the least, Mo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mo Chowdhury. I was also previously at FDA in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, focusing on pre-market review of cardiac diagnostic devices and then neurodiagnostic devices, and otherwise specializing in pediatric devices as well as optical diagnostics. Following my time at FDA, I was at the National Institutes of Health, helping to prioritize funding decisions for small business and tech transfer programs, as well as novel technology programs for NIBID. Following that, I was in industry at Philips Ultrasound, supporting cross-functionally their programs when it came to FDA submission and engagement preparation, as well as supporting product development for a specific product, specifically a maternal care tool used in resource-limited settings. I'm currently an entrepreneur in residence at Kickstart Venture Services based out of the University of North Carolina. And, having gone a little end-to-end post FDA, I'm really excited to discuss with this group and share actionable insights for you all as you are navigating from bench to bedside.
Thank you, Mo. So we're going to talk a lot about FDA and how FDA thinks about it. So to kick us off, all of you have seen between us, we've seen FDA from different vantage points as reviewers, as strategists, as innovators. What do you think is the single most important misconception that people have about the FDA process? And how does that misconception hurt them?
I can start with that. I think
Sure.
people maybe not so much a misconception, but a misunderstanding of how collaborative it's really intended to be, and how that interaction can really maximize value when you, as the startup or innovator, bring to the table clear information to the FDA and ask clear questions to get at the goal, your goals. And really kind of use the interactive process to your advantage, and kind of not wait too long to initiate contact with the regulators.
So FDA is a collaborator, not the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what is your perspective?
I think I'd want to build on that and say, and I know that Francesca had discussed this previously as well, is the art of asking and framing the question in a productive, beneficial way. There's something to it that it's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong way, but it's really something that you want the question and the materials that you provide to really show, hey, we've done our homework, we've given this a shot, we've come up with a plan. Based on that, do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have concerns? Also, making sure the questions are really targeted to where you are developmentally and sort of forward thinking in the sense of planning for where you need to go. So that's something where you kind of have to work with your group to find the sweet spot, because obviously you don't want to skip too far ahead. You don't want to be too behind, but it's really doing that to package together of where you are in your journey. And then based on that, here are the questions that you have for feedback.
Thank you. So there are different pathways that a startup can use, right? When a MedTech startup is thinking about FDA approval, they have to decide between a 510(k) or a de novo or a PMA. How should they approach that process? Maybe you can start with telling us what is the difference between a 510(k), a de novo, and a PMA, and then what is the thought process involved in making that decision of what is the right strategy for you. Martha, do you think you could shed some light on that?
Sure. And I wanted to just add one quick thing to the concept around misconceptions. I feel like, your question before you asked, like, what are things that we see frequently that are impacting like the innovators and the scientists that are coming with their great technologies? And the idea that is I always like to share with my companies is that you are the expert on your technology, right? So when you approach the FDA, you want to come up with the right set of questions to ask, like you're talking about Mo. And Francesca, to your point, it's like you want to have that conversation early and you want to make sure that they are your partner. But the other thing that you need to remember is like, you know your technology best. And so that's the perfect introduction for me also saying to people, well, let's talk about like, what do we think your long-term regulatory pathway is going to be? Understanding your technology allows us to say, okay, well, what is it going to be used in the long-term application? And understanding, do we have the ability to use any of the different regulatory pathways? Because one of the things we all know is that you don't choose necessarily your regulatory pathway. You are a good fit for one of the different regulatory pathways, maybe two, and then you can make a decision upon those to understand where you're going. So, by a show of hands, how many of you are pretty familiar with like the regulatory pathways that are available for different technologies to reach the market? I see a few hands, a little bit like shaky. Okay, right. So this is always the fun part, being an educator. We teach classes on bringing technologies to market, and we have to spend a lot of time talking about regulations and then how do you navigate that process, right? Which is why we're all here, right? Because the FDA process, although there's a ton of education materials by the FDA online, sometimes it's like hard to navigate it on your own. And that's why they're experts, right? Like, because we've done it before, or we are intimately familiar with one of the many different ways. So for me to, per your question, when we're talking about a lot of different med tech, we're trying to evaluate the way that we could get it through a regulatory approval or clearance so that we're able to market it. Excuse me, I'm getting over bronchitis, so you're gonna have to forgive me if I start coughing in the middle. But the most important things is that there are pretty much three main pathways. Like you said, a 510K, which is the clearance, a pre-market approval or PMA, and then we can talk about a de novo application. And so understanding your own technology and where it fits, both with a risk classification as well as how does it compare to current technologies on the market, allow you to pursue one of those three different pathways. Does that fulfill your question? Okay.
Sure, absolutely. So, Mo and Francesca, since you've seen more on the FDA side, do you what are some of the red flags that you might see where you might feel like, okay, this company has maybe not chosen the right pathway for their technology?
It can get pretty nuanced, I think, particularly between the choice of if it's a class 2 device, 510K versus de novo, is there an appropriate predicate or not? So some companies may just try to go 510K because they think it's faster and easier, but that might force
Mm-hmm.
them to put an intended use on their device that doesn't really signal any novelty to the market if they actually have it. Just to go the 510K pathway and avoid de novo. If you truly have something novel, using that to your advantage and maybe going the de novo pathway may be a better kind of business strategy. So there's multiple layers to these decisions. But I think, getting that outright, at least theoretical classification correct. I think class 3 devices highest risk are usually, there's no debate there. They're very, well defined in the legislation. But it can get a little nuanced with the class 2s and even, class 1 sometimes crossing over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
yeah.
would 100% agree on that. I think one thing that I've seen in my experience, either personal experience or, otherwise, is oftentimes, the choices are oftentimes driven by cost and time. That's sort of the fundamental, this is a business at the end of the day. But from a regulatory perspective, the shortest path isn't always the best path. And you really have to fundamentally think through, for instance, to the example Francesca brought up, if you are sort of bulldozing, you go through a 510K, you're just trying to go to predicate specifically because you're trying to, say, save time on the back end. Really take the time to think through it, think through the claims you're trying to make, think through the different elements of it when it comes to your intended user population, your clinical environment for use, the different types of end users that you could have, and the risks associated with them using the product. Little details like that to really thoroughly think through the risk profile, how it compares to whatever predicate you may be eyeing, and seeing what are the similarities or differences, and then leveraging some of the free resources from FDA, like the 510K substantial equivalence guidance, to even go through the flow chart and think through, okay, offhand, how would we do in terms of getting through this flow chart to get to an SE decision or not? All of which is to say, the shortest path isn't always the best path. And it may be a scenario where, in fact, it is really first of a kind, or it is de novo, maybe because it's a different intended use versus what's already out there. Celebrated de novo. It's something that, yes, there's trade offs, but there's also benefits and advantages that it can really have to you. So, something to keep in mind of just, picking the right regulatory pathway. It's really about strategy, not just the speed to market, even though we understand, the go to market speed is certainly important for your product launch. But yeah, something to just keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So if let's say that a startup decides that they're going to pick a 510K pathway when they actually should have picked de novo, how would that impact them in terms of time, cost, and money from a regulatory approval process? How would that one decision early on impact their strategy going down the line?
I'll start us off, and then if folks want to weigh in. So it's something that, in terms of impact to time, there is potential that overall time-wise, it can take longer to launch your product. So let's just say that it does go through the traditional 510K pathway, that you go through what used to be the RTA, now it's more a technical screen. You go through the SI review, and in the second phase of that review, the review team has at this point looked at your submission. They've engaged with you. They maybe issued an AI letter. They've looked at your responses to deficiencies, and they're still like, nope, it's still something that is a different or intended use, or maybe there's data presented that is showing that the methods that are used that are not adequate, or something to that effect, that essentially makes it NSC. Then that means that you're starting over after that to submit a de novo, and then dealing with essentially the de novo timeline review in addition to the 510K review, having to build that in and plan for that in your product launch. So that's the impact in terms of time. Then for cost, this is something that not only is it costly in the sense of you're not able to get your product launch faster, which means that you can't have that sales impact somewhat immediately, that's delayed, but also in terms of the resources that you may say need to shift around as a result of having to make this change in the regulatory pathway, both in terms of, specific to engagement with FDA or other markets that you may be engaging with, but also just the product development work that you're doing that can have some impact on cost of a very realistic potential increase in costs at the end of the day. So, it's something that, one of the things that I've certainly observed on the industry side is you're navigating uncertainty all the time, and you're working with the best information that you have available at that time to make a decision, go for. And I think it really speaks to the need to having somewhat of an agile strategy when you're going about it. But again, really speaks to what Francesca was saying, and sort of building on that of, if you really come to determine you are a de novo, it's something that, think through these trade-offs and really think through based on that how you want to prioritize with your group, because it's just something that there's a significant impact for trying the alternative approach of, we're just going to go 510K, and then if a de novo comes, we'll deal with it later, if you will.
Yeah.
I agree with all that, and I'll just stress the importance of the pre-submission process to try to avoid getting to that 510K NSC decision and wasting a long time. Whereas if you kind of have this conversation with the FDA early on, or at the appropriate time, you can try to minimize those delays.
Yeah, and that is so important. That brings me to my next question. When's the right time to talk to the FDA? Everyone says talk early, but is there something like talking too early? When would you want a company to come have that conversation with you? And Martha, from your perspective, like when do you advise startups that you're working with to, okay, now it is time for you to start having engaging with the FDA and bringing them into the conversation?
I mean, from the academic perspective, so a lot of the companies that we work with stem from technologies that are developed in an academic setting. We do then also do additional support for external companies that come to the university and want to partner with us to either pursue a regulatory strategy or even receive funding through a MIPS platform, which allows for a partnership between industry and through the university to get research done at a reduced cost to the company. So that's one of the nice benefits at working at the university is I get exposure to not just our academics, right, but other companies. And one of the things that we see consistently is that people will come to us, and if you come with this like academic curiosity point of view, you're so excited about the potential for a technology. And you've done, normally they've done proof of concept data, they've done maybe a technology assessment through like an early commercialization grant. Maybe they've even done some like preliminary pre-work to get ready to apply for an SBIR. At that point, I want to sit down with the company. I want to review the technology and make sure that the data that they're creating, those data packages, are going to support a long-term regulatory strategy, right? So we're not just answering questions around the technology and executing a concept, like is it hypothesis related, or is it actually answering the question around safety and efficacy? And so when we get to the point where we have enough data to support a conversation back and forth with the FDA, then you can actually say, okay, yes, now is the time to submit a pre-sub. You have enough preliminary data. You also have an understanding of like what your long-term data development package would look like, right? So you can say to the FDA, these are tests that I presume that I'm going to perform along with expected outcomes. And this is a sample size that I expect to have, and this is my plan, right? So you need to be far enough in the process that you have preliminary data that informs what you think is going to be your long-term outcomes. You can put it together in a package and you can say, if I present you with this data and these outcomes, do you think that this would be appropriate to either make a substantial equivalence claim or an SE claim that would actually allow for a 510K clearance? And if not, what am I missing, right? And so it's important, Francesca, you said this, like ask the right questions of the FDA. Don't ask open-ended questions. Like make sure that you know what you want to do. So when you approach the FDA, you want to make sure you have all the data, you understand what your potential risks could be if you do ask open-ended questions. So you want to be aware of the type of conversation you want to have, and then direct the conversation to answer your questions. Is this data that I'm going to collect? Granted, things happen, right? We all know that that's the way these things occur in science, right? But if you get the right outcomes and you get what you expect, could you have that conversation? So we always say to companies, let's prepare your data, let's assess it, let's do a gap assessment, and then we can make the decision to go to the FDA. So yes, early in mind for your regulatory strategy, but activating that conversation with the FDA through a pre-sub is a little bit later. Now you can always contact the FDA through DICE or one of their other consumer and industry outreach components.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody's interested in doing like an AI application in association with their either software as a medical device or their as part of a hardware application, then the FDA also has the group that looks at excellence in digital health. I think it's like the Digital Health Center for Excellence, which is another amazing resource when you're looking at AI applications, because that's what we're starting to see now is like, all right, can I do a 510K where I take a predicate device and say, I'm going to add an AI application to it? How do you show that it's like, safe and effective and substantially equivalent to a device that didn't use AI before? Right? So that's a whole nother conversation of like, what data do you need to have before you approach the FDA?
Yeah,
Completely agree with
absolutely.
Martha.
Like, you can tell I'm passionate.
To build on that, everything she said relies so heavily on your indication for use. So you really have to have gotten to the point where
Yes, that's true.
know what that IFU, what your proposed IFU is
Yes.
going to be, and you don't just have a technology that you're still looking for an indication
Exactly.
and patient.
And I will add to that as well to echo what Francesca's saying is in terms of timing, everything Martha has said is really spot on in terms of planning your evidence strategy. Really great thing to do. The other piece of that is, finalize that IFU, get as close to final as you can. Sometimes there's sort of cross-functional discussion of wanting to keep it a little more open-ended as you're planning for multiple MVPs or still doing customer discovery on certain markets to kind of see what the advantage would be. I get it. But the challenge when you go to FDA, and let's just say you don't have a very solid IFU, maybe it's because you are trying to keep it open-ended intentionally, maybe it's because you haven't really finished your customer discovery. The challenge is then you have engagement that may not necessarily move things forward for you. It's something that, if you go with, we think we're this, blah, 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 then FDA's response is, okay, but we don't really know what you're trying to do. And based on that, we can't really tell you what level of evidence you might need to demonstrate a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, whether or not you have a predicate device, whether or not you could sort of lay out an overall MVP scheme, let's just say, and kind of use your device as a predicate for future devices. It's something that it can sort of really impact the conversations and really impact the benefit of those conversations. So yeah, definitely what Francesca said of try to get as close as you can, or try to really refine it, finalize it, which also speaks to make sure you're prioritizing that customer discovery work up front so that you really make sure your solutions is addressing an unmet need, and based on that you're refining all of the components that usually get fleshed out with an IFU, which is indications for use. I don't know if I spelled out that acronym before, but I'll say it now.
Thank you for that. And so product market fit is important before you start your FDA process, yes?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Okay. Martha, you were going to add something? Oh, no.
No, I think you covered all of it. I mean, I think one of the things that we always recommend is that people pursue, if they have the opportunity to do like an iCore application, where you're trying to actually understand where does your technology fit within the workflow, as well as, what pain point are you solving, right? Like it's great to get a clearance, but if you don't have the market adoption, that you're expecting, then you're not going to have a successful product, right? Like we all know that this process is multifaceted. And today we're talking about, the regulatory side of it, but there is many different applications that you have to think about.
Right, absolutely. And if you don't have the right product market fit, you might pick a patient population that may not be the right patient population for the studies, right? And then that can take you down the wrong pathway. So this was so helpful. Like we touched on so many different aspects. There was one thing that I kind of picked up on as you were talking. Ask the right questions. So what are the right questions to ask, and what are not the best questions to ask when you're talking to the FDA?
I
Well, I
think
will
Mo
say,
started to touch on.
Francesca, go ahead.
Sorry. I think Mo started to touch on that a little bit earlier. These open-ended, like you can't just show up to the FDA and say, here's my device. What should I do with it?
Yeah.
You can't, and that's kind of the extreme end, but to the point that do your homework, make a proposal to the FDA backed by clear description of what your device is, how it's working, what it's doing, what you think the claim is going to be, and then specifically propose something to the FDA and ask if it's, if they agree or disagree, and not just kind of expect to just get blanket advice across all your strategic questions.
No, because the point is to answer questions, right? Not
Yeah.
provide advice, right? The FDA is not there to provide you advice. They're there to answer your questions. That's why we call it like a pre-submission, right? Or like a Q sub, right? So conceptually, it's all about questions. I always say to people, don't provide data that you haven't fully fleshed out. Make sure that you are answering and asking the questions that are like important for this phase, and don't ask questions for the future that you don't understand yet, right? So if you don't have a really good understanding of what your endpoint for stability would be, don't propose a stability endpoint that you're not sure you can hit, right? So like try to understand, that's an example, right? So just try to understand what you are capable of first, before you could propose anything, because you don't want to promise something you can't deliver on.
Very important point. Don't promise what you can't deliver. Make sure you have safety and efficacy data that you can present and that you're presenting a path forward. You're not going to the FDA and saying, tell us what to do with this. You're telling the FDA, this is our plan. Do you agree or disagree? Would that be a fair
and appropriate to the phase of development. So you may not have safety and effectiveness data, at your first pre-sub, but planning for that, could be part of the topic. What do you need, and what data do you have so far to build on? So those are all fair game for those conversations.
excellent? So, risk is a very big consideration with a lot of things, and companies want to undermine the amount of risk that is involved, and FDA might, overemphasize maybe perhaps the amount of risk involved for good reason, because we want to make sure that there is safety. How should a startup effectively communicate their risk? What does that look like, and how can they do it well with the FDA?
From a clinician perspective, get a clinician, not one clinician, as many clinicians, as much clinical feedback from the front lines as you can. Because there may not be a physical risk. It may be a risk due to a workflow or something, not from, that could really play into safety that you might not recognize. So I think having clinical partners early on can help hash some of that out.
Yeah, such an
Depending on what
important
it
point.
is too.
Yeah. I mean, we get so vested in our product that we might, keep drilling down into it. And it's important to get the end users, which in this case, more often than not, are clinicians involved in the conversation. Mo, what do you like to see typically when you were a reviewer? What kind of communication was something that you optimally like to see?
It's something that, going back to something I said earlier, which is, really walk through it stepwise, looking at your intended user population, environment for use, different types of end users, thinking through the changes in the risk profile based on that, communicating that clearly, because every FDA pre-market reviewer is trained to look at that. So communicate it. I think building on what Francesca said, in addition to just generally, yes, absolutely get feedback and have clinical partners, make sure to include them iteratively. Don't make that sort of you talk to them one time only. Do it over the different phases of your product development. If you make certain changes, say, hey, what would you think of this? If it's the user interface, you absolutely want them through the different iterations of that to give their perspective on what level of risk or what risky things may present themselves as you change the user interface, just as an example. Other things that I see is, and this is more of a documentation preparation type of thing, but as you are working with your cross-functional team on all of your different FMEAs, then make sure that you are including the different cross-functional partners. So this would include clinical, this might include design user experience, R&D, whatever, to all sort of think it through from their perspectives to identify the different risks, because they're all going to think about it from their lane, right? And so being able to have those types of dialogues iteratively throughout your product development will make any sort of risk management plan you come up with more comprehensive, but also then when you're specifically engaging with FDA, you're able to really highlight that and highlight sort of how your validation strategy is aligned with it, how your regulatory pathway is, likely the right fit based on that. So I think those would be the points that I would emphasize. I know that Famita just dropped off, probably because she was having some tech issues.
She's back.
Thank you, Mo, for continuing the conversation in my absence. So let's look at the other end. Let's say that a company has done everything and now they've submitted their final the final submission to the FDA for review. What are some of the reasons that the device might not get approved at that stage?
The right evidence.
Yeah.
I think
If
is
you're,
the big.
if what you propose you don't hit, right? So like if you can't show what you agreed upon as being effective or safe.
Or you proposed something and then went and did something else.
Oh yeah, that's a big one, right?
Yeah,
If you didn't do what you were supposed to do, right? Like that's always the,
it seems simple, but I've seen it.
it's like a
I
rubric in class, right?
Right. I think I agree with all of that. It's something that maybe you said you were gonna do one thing and then you did something different, or the evidence had some sort of misalignment when it came to the methods that you use for testing, or like Martha said, you don't hit the bar. Maybe you don't meet your endpoints. Maybe the sample size isn't sufficient to demonstrate that the study is statistically powered. Maybe there's something else that's impacting the generalizability of the data you did generate that then shows it's really not applicable to the intended user population. Translation, maybe it only works in one subgroup of your population, right? Maybe there's an intended use issue in terms of how the product is really used clinically that's different from a proposed predicate, assuming that you go like a 510K route. There's a lot of different things that can have some bearing, but goes back to what Francesca and Martha and others have said of really lean into you prioritizing the pre-sub process to try to have conversations around this in advance of a marketing application, so that sort of those inherent red flags, at least it's a good way to de-risk it and kind of make sure that when you do get in with your marketing application, that it's in the best shape possible, that you've done your best homework to inform it, that you've de-risked it as much as you can.
I know that we talked about as a team the utilization of a 513G, which is a request, to understand what your device is actually going to be evaluated as. And one of the feedback that I received from Francesca and Mo is that they've seen that it takes a lot longer than what I was familiar with. And that was one of those things that we had talked about. And I don't know, Famita, depending on our time, but I would love to hear Francesca and Mo a little bit more about your experiences using that evaluation technique, because that's something that we've pursued before and have not hit those long timelines. And I know that there's also the financial cost, right? So the question is for me, I always feel like the information that you get back is so helpful because it actually de-risks the next step to actually approach your data development plan. But I would love to hear your thoughts, because you guys said that some of the clients that you've worked with have skipped it completely and just moved ahead with the pre-sub because it's free, right? And so the question is like, how do you make that decision? Because I love the tool. So the question is like, how do you decide one or the other? I would love your feedback.
I think it's something that what I've experienced. So what I've experienced as a reviewer is that the 513G in general is basically an option that companies can use to get FDA's formal assessment using their databases of available predicates, this and that, to really determine the regulatory pathway. So is it PMA, de novo, 513 or 510K, or maybe it's not even a medical device that's subject to regulatory oversight. That's going to be sort of the option engagement wise to take. Now, like Martha was saying, it does cost some money, and it's something that from a time perspective is not MDUFA tracked. So for that reason, it is typically deprioritized relative to submissions that are MDUFA tracked or performance incentivized. Which, that's due to how things work in terms of those submissions, workload, nitty gritty. What I have seen is that a lot of innovators or companies often sort of skip to that and try to sort of incorporate those questions in a pre-submission request, or they'll submit a 513G, and the trade-off there is they may not get a very timely answer, which is a little bit of a setback when it comes to their product launch and activities related to it. What I would generally say is that I know that FDA, there's variability in terms of sort of the different groups that may see that question come in a pre-sub and say, okay, we'll answer it in a pre-sub, versus others that may really defer you to the 513G and kind of try to reroute you. And sometimes that's something that is more internal in terms of what the preferences is policy wise. That's something that weigh your options there. I think that and also, you know, if you're really trying to debate the appropriate avenue for it and you're not sure, you can always reach out to whoever your FDA point of contact is and say, hey, we have these questions. We understand that, you know, maybe pre-sub is not the preferred route, but we're trying to be sort of sensitive to it. What would you recommend doing? They may tell you, okay, but you got to submit a 513G. And then it's something at that point you guys have to sort of make a decision on the business end and say, okay, well, given our timing, given what we need, given what actions it may drive in terms of the decision that we get, here's what we do. So yeah, that's something that I've kind of seen it play out both ways. And what I will say as well is on the industry side, I have had an experience where we submit the 513G, and because we had very good rapport with the FDA folks that we were working with, it's something that there were enough touch points as we were engaging with them in parallel about other things that we were able to check on it and kind of, you know, nudge it forward, you know, for lack of a better way of saying it, and sort of say, like, it'd be really great to get it by this time. But again, that's that's really rolling the dice, right? And that's something that you know, would be very variable, very nuanced, but again, is an option for that formal assessment to determine regulatory pathway.
And I think that's also a maturity level too, because I work with a lot of small startups that don't have an FDA contact because they haven't even tried to do anything regulatory yet. So sometimes it can be difficult if that's going to be your first, you know, do you do the 513G so you're sure of your classification before you even get, sometimes there's that struggle there. But I think it also can depend on, very situation specific. So how much in question is this? It may be very worthwhile to go through that 513G, regardless of, maybe some cost and time, additional time. If that's like really the crux that's keeping you from further development. So
I know that when we've pursued it, it's because the question is, we're thinking that our intended use is a perfect fit, but the question is it an appropriate predicate? Right. And so it's like, is this actually going to be appropriate for a 510K, or should we just be pursuing a de novo? Right. And the time that we would risk going through, the same question that Famita asked earlier, where it's like we could go through the full 510K submission and get an NSE at the end, and then we're back to stage one anyway, right? So the question is, on my perspective, to de-risk it, I suggested that we did a 513G, right? And so that was allowed to provide enough data for us to make an informed decision for a regulatory pathway. But I think you're right. Maybe it's like for those that you're like, this is probably okay, and we probably can ask this in our pre-sub, and we're probably going to be, like, it just depends how comfortable you are with that risk platform. But it's interesting because I think everybody has different perspectives. And when you're applying for grant funding, a lot of the times they'll say, don't waste your money on a 513G, right? Take that $27.93 or whatever it's going to cost you and put it towards, reagents or or something else. Because it's like we all work with, small amounts of money in startups. But thanks.
Yeah.
That was
Money
great.
is a consideration, and also time is a consideration when we are talking about 513G, right? And so it then becomes a nuanced decision making around when should you do it and when should you not. Thank you guys for picking up the ball. I've been having some technical issues today, so thank you for picking up the ball on my behalf. We are 8 minutes. We have 8 minutes remaining in our session. I definitely have more questions to ask you, but this has been a very insightful conversation. And I want to open it up for questions if any of our audience members have questions that they would like to ask. Nancy.
Yes, I have a bit of a budgeting question, if you don't mind. So I work with a team of researchers. They've developed a clinical decision support tool. So it's software as a medical device. They have a lot of clinical data. We want to go through 510K clearance, and they have a shot at getting funding for that. So now to the budget. So I mean, the FDA fees are transparent, and we have a rough idea of like regulatory consultant hours. So what are we missing? I mean, there's like the usability and human factors analysis, and how do we need to think about that, and how would we budget for that?
So I would approach it as a scale, right? So if you expect to spend X on your regulatory hours, then you need to, decide how much you're going to spend on your human factors assessment. So the University of Maryland in College Park, we have a Center for Human Factors. Nancy, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They're part of like MECI. So you could potentially get in contact with them and maybe execute an assessment that costs a little bit less because you're within the system.
Okay.
So there's always that opportunity. But I like to say to people, you're probably going to spend about 3/4 of what you spend for your regulatory affairs on human factors assessment, depending on the complexity of your submission. But if you're talking as a software as a medical device with a 510(k), I think that's probably appropriate ranging. Francesca, Mo, I don't know about you.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I would
Right.
say there that I think Martha, definitely identified a way is, look at and this is just budget 101, but look at your overall budget right now to see what your available options might be in terms of cost savings overall. And then specific to this, especially for a product that is a clinical decision support tool and specifically a SAMD, which is software as a medical device. In terms of special controls, you're probably, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're probably prioritizing obviously your software, VMV, your cybersecurity, probably a little bit of interoperability depending on the device system design, labeling, and then human factors, I would imagine, as sort of at least the minimum in terms of special controls. So from that context, then it sounds like it's sort of looking into how much each of those areas are going to cost and then seeing how much you can sort of save within it. It does seem like human factors would probably be the biggest expense within that. But you obviously know the numbers better than I do. The other thing that I would generally say that it's a bit of a 2-for-1, not only budget, but regulatory planning, is sort of talk with your contacts or talk with the folks in your company to make sure that there's not any other sort of data requirements that you may need to plan for. So maybe, for instance, there's something very unique about your CDS tool that requires, some other type of testing or whatever. Making sure you plan for that as well so that you can look at that relative to your overall budget and then also see, okay, based on that, in terms of money we have available, maybe for human factors or for something like that, we can allocate and plan accordingly just so that you don't sort of fall in the red in one category and you can actually do whatever testing it is you need to do or other development efforts you need to do to kind of really get it in shape.
And Nancy, I would also recommend, does your team already have a regulatory consultant on board?
We have in the past. We have to re-engage.
Yeah, so there might be another thing that you might want to bring into the conversation around budgeting, because you'll also need to, beyond all these testing, etc., you'll also need to budget for a regulatory consultant to help you with all the filings and everything.
Yes, good point.
So Rob brings up a very important point in chat that FDA speaks its own language, pre-sub, 513G, IFUs, etc. For a new startup or for a young startup that has never been through this process before, this can all be very daunting. It can be challenging to figure out, right? What does all this mean? What advice do you have for a brand new startup that has not been through this process before? How do they familiarize themselves? How do they learn to speak the FDA language?
I know Martha mentioned it's not the easiest to navigate, and I would agree, but the FDA has a lot of publicly available, web-based educational tools. CDRH Learn has a lot of,
Yes.
kind of videos and that really provides a nice baseline understanding of these programs. And so I would start at least with the FDA website, not being able to find maybe exactly what you're looking for could be a potential roadblock. But for the most part, even if you just kind of search for CDRH Learn, it's divided out by topic, and at least that part is relatively easy to navigate. And I think full of valuable information.
I use it for my classes, right? Like I make my students review their case studies and watch the videos because I'm like, where else are you going to learn from the best, right? But from the people who are doing the work. Also YouTube videos that are put on by the FDA. Francesca, they're not always linked to in CDRH Learn, but that's a really good one. One thing I will definitely suggest to that you avoid is chat GPTing things. You know, we have so many great AI tools, but I would not trust it for something that you need to learn at this level of granularity. Just because, you know, a lot of generative AI does have the sometimes has the nuance that it will provide data that is not correct. Right? They call it like, you know, hallucinating, but it's not quite as exaggerated as that. But yeah, I would not put this into Chat GPT.
Yeah, very important point. So lots of resources on FDA's website, YouTube videos available by FDA. Please familiarize yourself with it using those as a resource. Yunling wants to know how many pre-subs are allowed. Is there a limit to how many pre-subs you can submit to the FDA?
You can submit as many as you want. What I would say is if you are planning on submitting a lot, work with your group to make sure you're strategic about it. It is not uncommon, for instance, for like a PMA or a breakthrough or something where, you know, companies will plan the topics for each pre-submission request to make sure each of them are covered and kind of build it into their project management plan overall. So yeah, you can submit as many as you want, but be smart about it, be strategic about it, and also generally keep it organized, because especially for ones that end up having extensive numbers of pre-subs, it'll help you as well as FDA if you keep very clear track of what conversations were discussed, what the key takeaways were, etc.
So let's very quick follow up on that. What's the timeline from the time you apply to have a pre-sub meeting till the time you actually get a pre-sub meeting? How should startups plan for that? How long does it take to get the pre-sub meeting?
So the current pre-sub guidance includes that, but it's roughly about 70 days. And that can sort of vary depending on other things going on. If you end up in the holidays, if you end up in a certain period. But that, at least for one pre-sub, is realistic to plan for. And that's something that does change with every MDUFA renewal, but that's, I believe, the current kind of going rate, if you will.
All right. Thank you. Any final thoughts before we end this panel? Any final piece of advice that you have for our companies that are on this panel today, on this call today?
I think Francesca already said it, but utilize the resources that the FDA provides. So, you know, scour the website, you know, engage with the Division of Industry and Consumer Education, which is DICE, right? They're there to help you use all the tools and make sure you get all the questions answered, right? They're there as your partner. They want you to succeed, right? Because you do your homework, you get a good grade, everybody's happy, right? It's like same concept always. So
And I think Martha said this earlier, but make sure you're mapping your claims to the evidence that proves it as you're developing your data development plan. Just keeping that in mind, that it's clear, it's actionable, and it beats more data without focus. Another thing I would say for choosing your regulatory pathway, choose it not just for speed, but for the story you want to tell your investors, the value that it creates down the line, and making sure that it is really fundamentally aligned with the unmet clinical need that your solution presents.
And thinking about
Thank
all
you.
of this early and not, you know, you can see how key the regulatory strategy can be to so many other things. So making sure you're kind of planning for that and engaging at the appropriate time.
yes.
Yep. Think early, engage at the appropriate time, make sure you have the right data, make sure you have a plan when you go to talk to the FDA, and then make sure that you have a product market fit before you talk to the FDA.
And communicate risk honestly, because reviewers care about that
Yeah.
impact and not just the scientific excitement of your product.
Very important, very, very important. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This was an excellent panel. And if people want to reach out to them, please, is it okay if they reach out to you via LinkedIn and connect with you? All right. Well, thank you all for your time. Yes, a recording of this will be available to everyone. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Famita.
you.
Thanks, Famita.